Hello, hello. This is Derek from One River Tea. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. So, in that last episode, I talked a whole lot about Hangzhou, this special city and ancient dynastic capital with a huge amount of living history. I told you about my time there visiting the whiskey library, the cocktail speakeasies, the Instagram-worthy cocktail and coffee houses, right next to, if not above or below, the tea-making world. I talked a little bit of how these two worlds interact with each other and just generally what it feels like to live and walk around a city with so much ancient history and so much modern life going on. In this episode, I'm going to revisit Hangzhou, but we'll stick around the Westlake area. I'll go into deeper detail about that magical spring water, that running tiger spring. I'll tell you the story about how I met the Dragonwell makers of 9 trees, that's Jiushu. And finally, I'll break down the entire processing procedure of making Dragonwell green tea, which involves frying it in a dry wok, letting it cool several different times, and I think the whole process is like 9 steps long. So, quickly again, to recap, in the last episode, we saw a lot of different faces. These are all the different people I was sourcing the Dragonwell tea from. These were all candidates of who I was thinking about sourcing the tea from. I drank all their teas, interacted with them, learned to connect with them, who they are, connected with them as people, and whatnot. And so, real quick, I talked about 4 different people. There were the 2 big masters, Tang Xiaojun and Tang Hejun, and then my buddy at 9 trees, that's Zhang Hailiang. And then finally, there was the guy with all the Chun Tijong, the heirloom varietal of Dragonwell, up behind the Running Tiger Spring, and that's Xie Chunhua. Now, as I reintroduce these people and their personalities and all the characteristics of their teas that they make, I'll take a short dive into the Chinese naming conventions. And it feels like I was just talking about this, but previously I was kind of mentioning a surface level phenomenon on how I address people in Chinese, right? I usually call them by their last name. I put a big or a small before it. So for example, my friend Zhang Yin Chao, who makes the Chaozhou teapots that we source, he's exactly 1 day older than me. And so I kind of jokingly call him Old Zhang, right? Even though he's just 1 day older than me, but there are several other ways I could address him. For example, all of these people in the Hangzhou area who are making these teas, they're all teachers. So I call them all Lao Shi. Some of them, like the Tang brothers, I call them master. That's Da Shi. So it's Tang Da Shi, Zhang Lao Shi, Xie Lao Shi. And a really basic explanation of the names is they put the last names first, right? So Tang Xiaojun, his surname is Tang, and then his given name is Xiaojun. Thus, of these 4 people, 2 of them already share a last name. And these last names are similar in the West, where a lot of times they're tied to a place, they're tied to a group of people that lived in a certain area and then eventually spread out. However, in China, there are not a whole wide variety of Chinese surnames. And so we saw Tang, we saw Zhang, we saw Xie. And these are all in the top 40 shared surnames in China. Doing a quick little Google search, I found out that there are over 12 million people in China surnamed Tang. So about 1 in every 113 people in China, their last name is Tang. And Zhang is even more common. Zhang is one of the top 3. Estimated 275 million people in China are surnamed Zhang. And they're often unrelated. They just bear the same surname. And it's essentially 1 in 5 Chinese people have the surname Li, Wang, or Zhang. And Xie is a little less common, with about 10 million people bearing the surname. But I've met people with surname Xie in many different provinces all throughout China. And it's still, the 23rd most common surname in China. And so if I'm trying to really let you understand a maker and I'm explaining, this is Zhang Laoshi, This is Tang Dasher. That is literally like saying like this is John Smith. This is Mr. Joe. It's the most like nondescript way to address somebody. And so while I would like to include their given names like Shaojun or Hejun, to the non-initiated ear, the person who doesn't know any Chinese, these are just unintelligible almost. Like, what's the difference between Shaojun and Hejun? Well, these Drun characters are actually different characters and they have different meanings. And so even though they sound similar, they're very different. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a leaf from one of China's 4 classic novels. I read this in university. It's called The Water Margin. And taking a tangent upon this tangent, China has 4 classic novels, all written in the Ming Dynasty or the Qing Dynasty. So this is like 1500s up until like the 1800s. And these 4 classic novels shaped Chinese literature culture. And without going in too deep, these are the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. This is The Journey to the West. That's the Monkey King. There's The Water Margin. And then there's The Dream of the Red Chamber, which is arguably the most influential. And even in Chinese universities, they have an entire department sometimes devoted to the study of this book, which is just phenomenal to kind of consider how important this one novel is to Chinese literary culture. And one of the reasons these novels were so significant is they're kind of like the Shakespeare of China, where what they did is they took a step outside of regular poetry, political, philosophical texts, and they wrote stories for the common people. They used the common language, which before this was kind of unheard of. Like the poets wouldn't do it, the philosophers wouldn't do it, the politicians wouldn't do it. And it was almost frowned upon. Like a lot of these books were banned simply because they were using the vernacular. The Water Margin, on the other hand, is a cool story. It's like a Robin Hood story. It's also called The Outlaws of the Marsh, and it kind of follows 108 folk heroes. They're kind of pseudo bandits, but again, they're kind of stealing from corrupt people and imposing order on the land. And so they're stealing from political officials and stuff like that. And eventually they kind of become powerful enough to assert a new order of law and peace. Now, the reason I bring this book up is because I read it in translation, and there are over 200 characters in this massive book. And they all have their own names and everything. And so if you're reading it in translation, you get really, really quickly lost in Huarong, Junyi, Lieheng. Like, who are these people? The translated version I had was really interesting because they did something that's a little uncommon. They took the names and they translated them into English. And so instead of Huarong, you get Glorious Flower. Instead of Junyi, you get the Handsome Justice. Instead of Lieheng, you get Flat Thunder. And it adds a lot of joy and life to the story for someone who doesn't read or speak Chinese when, Flat Thunder comes on the screen and just starts punching villains in the face left and right. And so taking a note from this translator's book, I'm getting back to it. What I want to do is reintroduce these people, but translate their names so that you can kind of see what, to the Chinese mind, these names kind of mean to them as well. So starting with the big master, Tang Xiaojun, who makes the most expensive, iconic Dragonwell around, who's a little arrogant, but really, really well respected, his Chinese name translates to Tang Little Army. And his counterpart, Tang Hejun, who makes the more natural White Crane Peak Dragonwell, his name aptly translates to Tang Gentle Crane. So we have Little Army and Gentle Crane. These are the 2 Tang masters. And then my friend Zhang Hailiang at 9 Trees, his name translates to Zhang Ocean Waves, which is pretty cool. And then finally, the last guy, the Chun Tijong cultivar guy, his name is Xie Chunhua, which translates to Xie Spring Blossoms. And while this is, a less common way to kind of approach and understand these Chinese names, I think it's illuminating and interesting because this part of this aspect of Chinese culture, naming culture, is often overlooked. All of these names are beautiful and auspicious, and the parents spend a long time thinking about the names, and it's not taken lightly. And each name is like a little prayer. It's like a wish for a certain destiny. And I really like thinking of these guys by their translated names. Like I'm hanging out with Little Army, Gentle Crane, Ocean Waves, and Spring Blossom. And it feels like I'm living in these mountains in the pages of one of the Chinese classics, in the pages of the water margin. And so it's really interesting when Chinese people ask me what my name means. Like, my name is Derek, and they ask me, like, oh, what does Derek mean? And I have to really do some research, do some digging, look at like Latin roots and be like, oh, it's De Rex, like of the king or something like that. And they're like, wow, that's really lovely. And I'm like, yeah, but my parents did not name me because it meant this. They named me because it sounded good, because they liked the sound of it. And that's usually pretty common. Not a lot of people are thinking about the origin meaning of the names itself. But in China, since, they're just using the characters, each character has its own special meaning. Anyways, long tangent, but again, this podcast is about Chinese culture and Chinese modern culture and what it's like to live here and kind of get the perspective of these Chinese names, meeting these Chinese people and how they address each other. So let's get back to the tea. Back to where we left off. We were in the last episode talking about the different areas of the Westlake area and the different people we were talking to. And the last person I talked about particularly was Xie Chunhua, the spring blossom. And we were looking at his garden out behind the Hangzhou Zoo, who has the heirloom cultivar. And so let's start there. Let's get back into the Hangzhou Zoo. And it's really interesting because the Hangzhou Zoo is a good entry point, because within it, or right next to it, it houses the leaping tiger or the running tiger spring. And that's where I'll start the story, because the first time I was in this area, I saw people with like these carts, like shopping carts, push baskets, strollers filled with just empty, 5-gallon jugs of water. And they would go to the springs and they would fill it up. But I never found out where the spring was until I went back to Hangzhou in late April, after I spent, 3 weeks in Yunnan looking for the pu'er teas. And so I got back to Hangzhou to meet with my friends and drink some of these Dragonwell teas again. And then particularly one of my motives was to find that running tiger spring. And so here's the story of me finding the running tiger spring water. Now, China loves its idioms, its small little sayings that kind of sum up a really big idea. And one of them for tea here is that 好马配好鞍,好茶配好水, which is a good horse deserves a good saddle. Good tea deserves good water. And this saying really comes up when people are talking about the running tiger spring water in Hangzhou. And there's another saying that's called the Hangzhou Double. And this is, the lion fighting the tiger. This is Westlake Dragonwell, brewed with running tiger spring water, is unbeatable. It's unparalleled. And so this spring water is actually really famous in itself. I think Qianlong mentioned it. He ranked it as the third best spring water in all of China. And it actually is kind of older than the Dragonwell itself. And it gets its name from an old Tang Dynasty legend. So the running tiger spring legend goes something like this. There was a monk in the Tang Dynasty that was enthralled by the beauty of the Westlake area, and he wanted to build a new temple here kind of on the slopes. And at that time, water was very important. If you wanted to build a house, if you wanted to build a settlement, a city, a temple, you need a good source of clean, drinkable water. But this area, for whatever reason, was totally dry. He kept digging and digging and couldn't find any well water, couldn't find any sources of clean water. And he was on the brink of giving up, moving to, a more feasible location to create his new temple, when he had a dream. In the dream, there were 2 tigers that were running and rerouting the local spring water to flow right before his temple. And so he wakes up and he goes to a nearby cliff and he sees 2 white tigers digging furiously. And as soon as they see him, they run away. And to his delight, when he goes to the place they were digging, he finds the bubbling head of a spring. And this becomes the running tiger spring. Now, as is my wont, I like to analyze these legends with a little bit of historical context. And a lot of myths, are essentially forms of poetic historicization. They're taking what actually happened in history and giving it a little flair. So let's take a brief detour down the history of the Westlake area and its temples that arose in the Sui and the Tang Dynasty. Now, looking at Hangzhou City geographically, the city sits east, a little northeast of the Westlake area, and hugging the west side of the city is the aptly named West Lake. In ancient times, this actually was kind of a nuisance for the people of Hangzhou because it was very silty. It was like an overflow of the Qiantang River, and it would flood all the time. Really, really unusable, but you could get some good drinking water from it. But due to poor irrigation, it was just kind of a mess. This all changed when the poet magistrate Bai Juyi took over in the Tang Dynasty, and he not only built sufficient dams and irrigation systems to make it usable, but he also started making it beautiful. He built a causeway that pedestrians could cross on foot and walk across the entire lake. There's a botanical garden in the lake now. It's really, really lovely. Some really great poets like Li Qingzhao are buried there, and they made their homes in this Westlake area all because of this poet Bai Juyi, who was kind of the mayor of the city in the Tang Dynasty. And so this began the Westlake's glorious era of becoming a beautiful scenic spot, not only for people of Hangzhou and nearby areas, but eventually for the imperial court itself. Additionally, due to this incredible feat of engineering, suddenly fresh water was able to be supplied to all of Hangzhou City. And so, right around this time, it would make sense that there was a deeper understanding of the spring water, the irrigation systems, and people being able to reroute a certain spring or whatnot to that running tiger temple and its incredible spring water. So, here's that little seed of historical fact behind this legend, which, solidifies it in the Tang Dynasty. So, getting back to Hangzhou, the city sits essentially on the northwest bank of the West Lake. And then the West Lake rises to the west of the West Lake, rises the West Lake Scenic Area. And these are small mountains, like maybe 300, 400 meters, really not tall, but beautiful. You can climb them and see the whole city and the lake, and it's really, really lovely. And as we discussed in the last episode, there are essentially 5 main core regions and then the Meijia Wu. So there's the tiger, there's the lion, there's the dragon, there's the cloud, and then there's the plum. And additionally, there's the Meijia Wu. And each of these 5 main core regions have about 800 mu, where the Meijia Wu village has about 2,000 mu. And again, mu is that classical Chinese measurement system, agricultural measurement system, which is about 0.166 an acre. So in total, this scenic area has just under 1,000 acres of tea plantations. And 2/3 of that is split between the 5 main core regions, and then 1 solid third of that is the Meijia Wu village. These numbers were actually pretty hard for me to find. I was doing a lot of research online, and I was getting so many different statistics, so many different numbers. And finally, I was just like, you know what? I'll just message my friend at Jiushu, Shan, who I'll talk about later in this episode, and she immediately sends me all of the details, all the information, the breakdown of the different regions. And this is just what's so lovely about meeting these people living in China and speaking the language. I can just ask the people in the area facts about the area. I don't have to do this online research about, oh, this site says this site says this. I can actually just ask the people living there. So it's really wonderful to get these numbers. So where were we? We were entering the Westlake area through the zoo. So the zoo is like, the Hangzhou Zoo is one of the entry points into this scenic area. A lot of the city folk, they love coming to the zoo because it's right at the edge of the Westlake Scenic Area. And what's interesting is the Running Tiger Spring is right behind the zoo. Or it's actually a little south of the zoo. This is where you can actually fill up your water bottles. So even though I've been walking through the scenic area so many times over the past 6 or 7 years, I've never actually found the place where you fill up your water. What's interesting is there's the public fount where you can fill up your water bottles that you bring in with this wonderful spring water. And then there's the actual temple that's a little deeper into the mountains. And so I've been to the temple deep in the mountains, and I thought that's where I could fill up the water, but they were like, no, you can't fill up your water here. You have to go down near the zoo. And I was like, okay. And I've wandered around trying to find it several times in the past few years, but I've never actually really opened a map, sought it out, and said, today I'm going to find the running tiger. It's probably a little bit of my Taoist nature of, not seeking too directly for anything in particular, or my altruistic proclivity for desiring destiny just to open everything up for me and clear the path when the time is right. But I've wandered absentmindedly in search of the spring several times to no avail. And I kind of like that wandering through these bamboo mountains looking for an ancient spring feeling. But this trip, I went back with a few friends. in later spring. And this time I finally opened the map because I was determined to find it. So I opened the map and found that the public spring is actually really close to the main road, which does make sense because this is why I've never found it before. And it also makes sense for the people wanting to fill up 5 gallon jugs all of the time. You don't want them to have to hike through, deep mountains and bamboo woods, bamboo forests and stuff like that to get it. It makes sense to put a spring font for the people close to the parking lot. And even though I say it's close to the parking lot, it's really well manicured. And so you kind of enter this scenic area that leads you to the Running Tiger Spring. And even though it's just a few hundred meters from the road, it's still really well designed. So you're walking through winding moss covered stone paths, banked by koi ponds and frogs and lily pads and lotuses. And there's overhanging bamboo forests, and everything's green and covered in moss. And it's really beautiful. And so we followed the throngs of people with their empty bottles, the strollers, the shopping carts, and we're encouraged by the travelers returning with their bottles sloshing with the legendary spring water. And eventually we get to a point that you turn off a hard left, and that's the spring font. Finally, I found it. And of course, there's this large line and just a small trickle of water from a few stones. And so we saw people bring their own pipes, bring tubes that they would just like put into the crack between the stones and then feed into their bottles so that they could just step back and let their water fill up. But it kind of takes a long time to fill up 5 gallons of water with just this, it's not a really small trickle. It's kind of like a mild gush, but still it takes a long time. So there's a pretty long line. So we have to wait for a while. But one really wonderful thing about this is that some of the highest quality spring water you can get in China is absolutely free for the taking. There are no ticket prices. There's no price per bottle. There's no cost at all. It's just you have to wait in line. And while I'm sure there are a lot of modern scientific delvings into the exact chemical composition of this water, why it's so amazing, the specific science of this is not quite my thing. I kind of like the magic idea of it as well. And instead, I kind of talk about the ancient methods of measuring the quality of the spring water. And one of the big things that they like to do is the tension test. And you've probably noticed this phenomenon with water because water is polar. It's bonded to itself. You can fill up a cup just above the rim with water and it doesn't overflow. Supposedly, the measure for a good spring water is how much you can overflow it before it spills over the sides of the cup. With the Running Tiger spring water, you can actually fill it over a centimeter above the brim of the cup before it spills over. And so just looking at the tension test of this water, it really is exceptional. Anyways, finally I completed my pilgrimage to the Running Tiger spring water, and that was one of the highlights of this trip. And I was able to fill up a few bottles and bring them to my friends at the Nine Trees to brew some incredible wood fire wok-made Dragonwell. And while that was an incredible experience, that's really not the topic for this episode. I wanted to mention the spring water because it ties into this Trinity Garden, the Running Tiger Spring area, the core area. So let's step back in time a few weeks to when I first got there with Xie Chunhua, the Xie Spring Blossoms, and he was showing me his Trinity Gardens. So walking up through his Trinity Gardens, just above the Running Tiger Spring area, eventually there are these kind of paths. These are a little more less manicured paths, so a little more dirt paths. You see people harvesting these little bushes, and eventually you crest the ridge, and all of a sudden you're on the White Crane Peak Ridge that looks down into the Mandrelong village. And so this area is literally right between the Running Tiger, and it goes down the slopes and goes up to the Dragonwell, and then hits the Lion's Peak. And so technically it's in that long area, the Dragon area, but they say it's really essentially between Lion's Peak and the Running Tiger. And so this is really just the prime area, that core region for the Dragonwell production, and all of these 4 or 5 smaller core regions are very close to each other, and they kind of overlap. You go over a mountain ridge, and suddenly you're in the next area. And so sometimes it's difficult to say, well, this is Dragon, or this is Lion's Peak, or this is the Running Tiger area. Sometimes it's a little more distinct if they're not neighboring each other, but sometimes they do blend into each other. So this whole scenic area is incredibly small. You could hike the whole thing in a day, you could wander from one area to the next, and it is really, really lovely to walk through these mountains. And so at this point, I kind of leave Xie Spring Blossom, and go off my own way. And I'm walking through the slopes of these terraced tea fields, and I notice that I mentioned last time, the Dragonwell 43 cultivar is a little more short bushes and clean cut rows, where every time you see the Tijong cultivar, it's just big globular circular bushes that are kind of erratically placed. And so you just see a big patch of them. And so I'm really interested in seeing how this looks from the air. So I take out my drone, and I'm excited so I can see this bird's eye view of this distinction is really, really clear. As soon as I lift the drone up, it's beautiful. I actually put some of these videos on the One River Tea YouTube if you're interested in seeing this mesmerizing bush of traditional bushes versus modern cultivars and stuff. And so anyways, I get out my drone. I'm flying my drone right above the west, in the Westlake area, above the Baihefeng, the White Crane Peak. And I'm getting some really distant shots. I'm seeing how far I can get from the tea slopes and everything. But then what happens is the drone signal just drops. It gets totally interrupted. And this happens a lot of times in big cities when there's a lot of Bluetooth interference. But right when I'm getting this really beautiful shot of the distant mountain, the video cuts out. My drone starts beeping the alarm thing, and I'm worried about it falling out of the sky. And all of a sudden, somebody next to me comes up and says, hello, are you Dan Ching? And I look over, and it's this beautiful girl who I think I saw last night in the tea house. And again, I'm just like, my drone is just beeping like crazy. And I pride myself in my equanimity, where I calmly put the panic of my drone falling out of the sky and me losing all of that footage into a small, bright, alarming corner of my mind. And I turn to her and I say, yeah, I'm Dan Ching. I don't remember giving you my name, though. And real quick, Dan Ching, talking about the names, Dan Ching is my Chinese name, which literally means like the blue and green coloration mountains get in the distance. It's a very natural color. It's not blue, it's not green, but it's the color of mountains in the distance. Another meaning for this is an old Chinese style of painting. And this is usually with a lot of cinnabar reds and this really, really cool old style painting. And so when people hear my name, they're like, wow, that's a really beautiful name. Anyways, so she says, oh, are you Dan Ching? And I'm like, yes, but I don't really remember giving you my name. Who are you? And I say this in a polite way because she's with a bunch of people as well. And she mentions that she saw me come into Nine Trees last night with my tea master, and she was a little too busy to say hello to me, but she is one of the owners there. She's one of the 4 owners there. And now here comes a really important part. She immediately says something like, wow, what are the odds that I found you again in the mountains? We really must have this destiny. And the phrase she actually used was yuan fen, which I'm not sure if I've mentioned it before in this podcast. Probably. It means karmic tie. It's this idea that maybe in a past life, in this life, in a future life, you have this bond of destiny. You're destined to meet in this life or the next, or maybe you did in the past. And it's kind of a Chinese rationalization of the levels of luck we were talking about. And the old adage where like attracts like. But I hear this term a lot, and maybe it's just me or maybe it's everyone, but I get this term a lot, this yuan fen idea. And what she does, she says, wow, it's so amazing I met you again in the mountains. We definitely have this destiny. And then she gives me her short name. Her short name is Shan Shan, which means something like little flicker or something like that. As I mentioned, a lot of Chinese people, they have their full names, their short names, the names other people call them. And so she immediately gives me a more intimate name, this kind of like deep cut into like we're old friends now, this feeling. And so I'm immediately reminded as my drone is falling out of the sky of this incredible, my favorite book of Chinese translated poems. And the namesake of the book is When I Find You Again, It Will Be in Mountains. And it's a book of collected poems from the Tang Dynasty by the disappointed Buddhist poet Jia Dao. It was translated by the legendary Mike O'Connor, published by Wisdom Books. It's really one of my favorite books. I lent it to a friend in Wuhan one time, and he kept it for a year and a half, and I couldn't get it back. So I literally took a train to Wuhan, to see my friend, but ostensibly to get this book back because I, I really, really like this book. It was one of the first books I read in my university library, the first Chinese poetry books I found in the university library that turned me on to Chinese poetics, the feeling of traveling through China and living in China and wandering mountains. And so it's been a really big formative book for me in my life, in my endeavors, what I want to do. And here I am in these rural Chinese mountains, meeting people with a karmic destiny tie. And so I'm immediately thinking of this book, and it's this incredible book. It's broken up into seasons, and they all have the themes of departure. The poems have themes of departure, separation, isolation, meditation, and that deep feeling of connection with the natural universe. And so, to further explain this deep sensation I'm feeling upon meeting Shan Shan in the mountains again, I'll read you like the poem that gives the book its name. Now, bear in mind, this poem was written in 700 AD, so 1,300 years ago. And yet, for me, the sentiments really still ring true today. And I feel like this poem is another one of a poem of separation, of departure. So it goes like this, and again, I'm reading from Mike O'Connor's elegant translation. It's titled Seeing Off a Man of the Tao. And it goes, When I find you again, it will be in mountains. This morning, I lose you once more to farewell. Free of attachment in heart and mind, is it why you can go 10,000 li alone to places with such little human warmth, where when you meet someone, they speak an ancient tongue. Traveling without disciples, you have only a white dog for company. And so here I am in the mountains, alone, where everyone's speaking another language, and somebody comes up to me and essentially quotes this book to me, and I'm really, really moved by it. And as the brain does, as soon as this thought arises in my mind, this book of poems, I'm thinking of another poem as well, and a phrase in that poem that I wanted to use for a publishing company if I ever began publishing my own translations of obscure, previously untranslated Chinese poetry. The term is zhiyin. Zhiyin kind of translates to an intimate friend or a soulmate, but the origin kind of comes from an old poem called High Mountains and Running Waters, and it's kind of used to describe somebody who's meeting another friend of poetry. Like, we're friends in the society of letters and friends in knowing the subtleties of life. And the line kind of goes, the poem title is High Mountains and Running Waters, Seeking a True Friend. And the first line is something like, snobbish people attract snobbish minds. Those with a refined heart, how hard it is to find another like you. And the idea here is that antiquated like attracts like, but it's really difficult to find this true soulmate. And so when it does come around, when you meet somebody who has, your same interests and passions, doing the things that you love, how much more powerful is it? So after making this connection, and as if by the logic of dreams, my drone suddenly connects to my phone again, and everything returns to safety, and I can return it to where we are. And I add her WeChat, and I make a plan to visit her tea house this evening to learn a little more about the processing of Longjing, sample more tea, and potentially buy some teas, some Mingqian Longjing teas for samples, for private orders. Again, this is still late March. I don't think we've hit April yet. And so the tea is really, really at its peak right now, the highest quality tea you can possibly buy. And so I'm in the right place, meeting the right people, and I just feel very incredibly lucky. So after that long and I dare say lovely diversion into the mountains and poetry of modern China, imbued with the feelings of ancient heroes with their names and the poems from 1,000 years ago, let's return to the meaning for this episode, the purpose here, the production of Longjing tea. How is it made? What are the exact processes, the effort involved, and the people behind it? So, as I mentioned earlier, this year saw an incredibly wet spring. There were so many rainy days, bad weather days, a lot of days no tea was picked when it should be being picked. And so, after flying my drone, I return to my hostel and I get ready to go to 9 Trees after dinner, and the rain comes back. And so I get to 9 Trees, and it's a rainy, rainy night, and I see a group of apprentices in their green shirts all making Dragonwell in the rows of the walks. Today, they were able to harvest, they were able to wither, because the rain didn't start until the evening. And so the evening is usually in most of the tea making regions in the world, in China, the evening is when you make the tea. You pick it in the morning, you wither it during the day, and then you process it at night. And so I get there just after dinner and I see everyone working, and it's just really wonderful because everyone's talking, they're laughing, there's the smell of green tea being baked in the wok, there's the sound of rain on the overhang, and the sound of scattering dry leaves and the dry metal walks, and it's just I'm mesmerized by it. So I just walk around, take a lot of photos, take a lot of videos, and I see Zhang Ocean Waves, Zhang Hailiang, making his tea in the traditional wood-fired wok. And this is, the first time I've actually seen it done. I heard it was done before. This is the first time I'm seeing it being made. And it requires two people, somebody who's just feeding wood into the wok, taking wood out of the wok and in the base of the wok for the flames and stuff like that, and somebody else who's making the tea. And so there's this really good communication between the two. They've been making tea together for a really long time. And so the guy who's tending the fire knows the process. And so he knows when the flame should be higher for the kill green, lower for the drying, and whatnot. And it's really just mesmerizing. And what's really interesting about Longjing that's different from a lot of other teas is you do not put a lot of tea into the wok, like maybe 150 grams of tea at a time when you're making it. So actually, it might be similar to Bilochun. I think Bilochun has more. Like the ratio for Bilochun was like 600 grams goes in and then you get 150 grams out. Again, remember there's that 75% water loss that's going on. And so for Longjing, it seems like they're making even less every time. So in every processing, they can make, 100 to 150 grams of dry tea. And let's talk about the processing now. So there are 9 main steps in making Longjing tea, Dragonwell tea. The first stage is the picking stage. So the fresh leaves are picked. Again, they're plucked. They're not picked. You're not using your thumbnail. You're pulling the leaves off of the stem, and it should snap. If you cut it at all, if you use a machine to cut it when you're harvesting, if you use your thumbnail, this will create an accelerated oxidization where you trim the leaf from the stem. And this kind of prevents a really good withering effect because that's now bruised. That area where a lot of the water would leave the tea is now bruised and obstructed. And so sometimes that doesn't allow a good tang liang. When this is that stage, the tang liang, which Tang Little Army says is not quite withering. But so after the tea is picked, then you spread it out really thin on sheets. And this is the tang liang. This is when it's withering. And this takes a few hours. Little Army wouldn't tell me exactly how long. He says it depends on the moisture content, the humidity, the water level, etc. And it does. But usually it's a good few hours, 3, 4, 5 hours. After this tang liang phase, when the leaves become a little more pliable, kind of a little rubbery to the touch, they're put into the wok for the first kill green phase. This only takes about 30, 40 minutes of low heat. I think it's like 250 degrees Celsius. And this is when they're throwing it in the wok, they're lifting it up, they're shaking it, they're moving it all around, they're constantly in motion. Once it kind of becomes a little dry and you can hear the sound of the leaves hitting the wok, then it's removed. And then it's put on the racks again. This is kind of cooling down. This is called returning the moisture of the tea. This is so that they don't stress the leaves too much. Unlike Bilochun, where it's made in a wok a single time, this has the hui guo, which is the return to the wok, the removing of the wok. So Longjing, they kill the green, then take it out and let it cool again. After it's cool, they do the first screening. This is when they shake the broken bits out of the tea, and they're trying to keep only the whole leaves in it. After this, it's returned to the wok and further dried. And then after it comes out of the wok the second time, it should be totally dry now. And then they do another screening where they sift the broken leaves out, and then they heap it into piles so that everything that's being made that day from the same area is being piled together. So this is kind of like a homogenization process. We saw this in the white tea production. In white tea, they call it the yang cha, which is like raising the tea. And this is if you have a lot of different tea from different gardens, you put it together at a certain phase and the flavors kind of meld. Interesting. After this, it's put into muslin cloths and to be packed or sold. So the 9 main stages here: picking, withering, kill green, cooling, sifting, drying, sifting, piling, storing. So that's a lot of information for a podcast. I'll probably make a blog post, make a video so that if you're really curious, you can see the processes, photos of the processes, videos of the processes, and you don't have to remember 9 things that I'm telling you right away. Those 9 phases are the traditional all handmade processings. And so when buying Longjing, if I'm buying this Bai Hefeng, this White Crane Peak entirely handmade tea by the people at 9 Trees, it costs quite a lot of money. I think I sell it at $2 a gram for the Mingqian teas. And this is, not the earliest harvest, but a kind of a later harvest, but still Mingqian. And if you want to, you can get even more specific where you can get it made by the master, by Zhang Hailiang, or by his apprentices. You can get it from the Bai Hefeng or a certain other peaks. I think they have the Tang Toshan, and another area that's really close to the ancient 18 legendary trees right by the temple, the Hu Temple. And so those cost quite a bit more. But you can also get it half handmade. You can get it machine made. You can get it made from Qiantang, the area just across the river, the Qiantang River from Hangzhou. And that's where I actually sourced the Guyu green teas. The Guyu green teas are a half handmade from the Qiantang region, because the purpose for the Guyu greens, or the later April harvested green teas that we sell, is to make it affordable. Is to make it affordable for everyone, but I'm still sourcing it from 9 Trees because I trust them. And for me, trust is a huge thing, especially for Dragonwell. When there are so many people making Dragonwell from so many different regions, they have the Dragonwell 43 cultivar out in Hubei. That's where they make a lot of the Ensure Yulu out of the Dragonwell 43 cultivar. And so they also say, yeah, we can make it flat if you want. We can make it look like Dragonwell if you want. And there are places in Guizhou and Sichuan that exclusively do knockoff Dragonwell green teas that look and taste great. But for me, my purpose is really understanding this specific terroir of this region. And so getting back into the different grades, I want to make a sampler that has something like core region versus Qiantang. So what's the different taste between what's actually in the Westlake area versus what's outside the Westlake area, very nearby? I want to make a whole handmade versus half handmade kind of explanation of, okay, can you taste the difference? Can you see the difference between these two different things? I want to get a number 43 cultivar versus a Trintijon cultivar. And so in this sampler I'm thinking about making, there should be about 6 different teas. Some of them should be really expensive, others a little cheap. They're inexpensive. They're all pretty expensive, but I'm thinking about making that probably later this month. So keep an eye out for that. There's also, when I talk about machine-made or half-handmade teas, usually what happens, and I saw the people at my hostel doing this, right outside in the front door area, they were making green tea, and they have this machine with a really, it's like a cylinder with like a flat kind of a cylindrical hammer that brushes the tea leaves and brushes the tea leaves, and this is the kill green and shaping phase. And so the half-handmade, after the tea is withered, they just dump it into this machine, and it kills the green and gives it the right shape. Then what happens is you sift it and you return it to the wok for the final drying process. And so this is the half handmade process. And so it's really interesting to see the whole handmade versus half handmade, because whole handmade has no real machinery, it's just the wok. And the half handmade has this really nice shaping kill green machine to it. One last thing I want to mention is in this episode is how everyone was drinking tea in the Longjing area, in the Manjuilong. They were using 2.5 grams of dried tea in a 100 milliliter gaiwan, and they were brewing it Gongfu style. They were doing flash infusions with water about 90 degrees. They said supposedly if it's whole handmade, you can use 100-degree water, no problem. But if it's half handmade, you can't use 100-degree water. You only want to use cooler water to do it. And so they do 22.5 grams in these 100 milliliter gaiwans, brew it 6, 7, 8 times. Of course, lengthening the infusions every time. And so that gave me the idea for this sampler. I want to include 5 grams of 6 different types of teas, and this should be enough for 2 sessions of each tea. So that's quite a bit of tea there. That's 12 different sessions of Dragonwell you can get out of that. And so for me, before I was always exclusively a grandpa-style green tea guy, and I still am for a lot of the teas, particularly the Bilochuan, but for this Dragonwell, I'm now exclusively a gaiwan guy. And so I'm only brewing 2.5 grams in gaiwans at a time. Very rarely do I do the bowl style or the grandpa style, which, Tang Gentle Crane does that. He likes to do it in the cup, in the big bowl, but he's also a little more Taoist, I guess. So that kind of concludes my sourcing, my explanation of Dragonwell in this area, how they're making it, how they're growing it, the regions, how I sourced it, how they're making it from picking to drinking, and all of that. So this will kind of conclude my Dragonwell episodes for this tour. I think what I'll do is I'll start talking about my spring tea trip. Well, the next place I went to is Chaozhou. I went to the Wudong Shan, the Wudong Mountain, and I spent a good week there. And so I'll kind of show you the people I met in the Wudong Mountain, the Dansong Oolong. I'll give you a brief introduction to the Dansong Oolong. This won't be my full history. It'll just be the spring sourcing trip of 2023 to Wudong Shan. Again, this is Derek from One River Tea. Thank you guys so much for listening, and it's been a pleasure to record this again, so hopefully I'll get back on track with the constant recordings, but you guys make it all worth my time, so thank you guys so much for listening, and until next time, brew happy.